Margaret Thompson sat in her economy seat, clutching her worn leather purse as passengers filed past her on Flight 447 to Chicago. At 78 years old, she had learned to travel light, carrying only the essentials for her surprise visit, to see her son Richard. The airlines had changed so much since she first started flying decades ago, but she still felt a thrill every time she boarded a plane. Sarah Mitchell, a flight attendant with 5 years of experience, was having one of those difficult days. Her supervisor had already criticized her twice this week for being too lenient with passengers, and she was determined to prove herself as someone who could maintain order and follow company policies strictly. She prided herself on running a tight ship and ensuring every passenger followed the rules to the letter. As Margaret tried to lift her small carry-on bag into the overhead compartment, her arthritic hands struggled with the weight. The bag slipped slightly, and she had to step back to avoid it falling on her head. A few toiletries scattered onto the floor, and she bent down slowly to collect them, her movements careful and deliberate due to her age. Sarah noticed the commotion and walked over with a stern expression. She had been trained to spot potential problems before they escalated, and in her mind, an elderly passenger struggling with luggage was exactly the kind of safety issue that needed immediate attention. Without asking if Margaret needed help, Sarah grabbed the bag from her hands. "Ma'am, you clearly cannot handle your luggage properly. This is a safety concern for other passengers," Sarah said in a crisp, professional tone that carried more authority than warmth. "I'm going to have to ask you to check this bag, and I need you to demonstrate that you can follow safety instructions." Margaret looked up, surprised by the harsh tone. She had flown this same route many times before and had never encountered such treatment. "Oh dear, I'm sorry. I just needed a moment to arrange things properly. I've been flying for over 40 years, and I assure you I can manage." Sarah's expression remained unchanged. She had seen too many elderly passengers who overestimated their abilities, and she wasn't going to let sympathy cloud her professional judgment. Age doesn't matter when it comes to safety regulations. If you cannot handle basic tasks like stowing luggage without creating a disturbance, then perhaps you should consider whether flying is appropriate for you. The other passengers began to notice the interaction, some looking uncomfortable as they witnessed the exchange. Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, but she maintained her composure. She had raised 5 children and built a successful business from nothing, and she wasn't about to let a young flight attendant intimidate her. "I understand your concern for safety, but I simply had a momentary difficulty with the latch," Margaret explained patiently. "If you could just give me another moment, I'll have everything sorted properly." Sarah shook her head firmly. "I'm afraid that's not acceptable. Company policy is very clear about passengers who cannot safely manage their belongings. I'm going to need you to move to a seat where we can monitor you more closely. And frankly, I'm considering whether you should be on this flight at all." Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief. In all her years of travel, she had never been spoken to with such disrespect. She thought about mentioning that she had flown millions of miles and held the airline's highest frequent flyer status. But something told her that this young woman wouldn't care about such things. The situation was attracting more attention now, with passengers craning their necks to see what was happening. Some looked sympathetic toward Margaret, while others seemed annoyed by the delay. Sarah felt the pressure of all those eyes on her, which only strengthened her resolve to handle the situation by the book. "Ma'am, I need you to cooperate with me here. Either you follow my instructions or I'll have to call the captain and have you removed from the aircraft," Sarah continued, her voice growing slightly louder. "We have a schedule to maintain, and I cannot allow one passenger to jeopardize the safety and comfort of everyone else." Margaret took a deep breath, drawing on decades of experience dealing with difficult situations. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best approach was to remain calm and dignified, even when others around you were not. "Young lady, I am simply an elderly woman trying to visit her family. I mean no harm to anyone, and I'm perfectly capable of flying safely." As the confrontation continued, neither woman realized they were about to set in motion a series of events that would change both their lives forever. Margaret had not mentioned her last name or her connection to the airline. Preferring to travel as just another passenger, Sarah had not bothered to check the passenger manifest carefully, or noticed the special codes next to certain names that indicated VIP status. The stage was set for a collision between authority and dignity, between policy and humanity, and between a flight attendant determined to prove her worth and an elderly woman who had built an empire in the skies. Sarah's patience had completely run out. The boarding process was taking longer than scheduled, and her supervisor would definitely notice if they had any delays. She looked at Margaret with increasing frustration, seeing only a stubborn elderly passenger who refused to follow simple instructions. The power she felt in her uniform and position gave her confidence to push harder. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. I need you to gather your things and move to seat 32F where we can keep an eye on you, or I will have no choice but to contact ground security to escort you off this aircraft," Sarah announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear clearly. Margaret felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She had built Thompson Airlines from a small charter service into one of the most respected carriers in the country. She had sat in boardrooms with industry leaders, negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, and earned the respect of everyone in aviation. Yet here she was, being treated like a common troublemaker by one of her own employees. "I don't think that will be necessary," Margaret said quietly, hoping to de-escalate the situation. "I'll move to whatever seat you prefer, but I really don't understand why this is such a big issue." Sarah felt a small victory, but she wasn't finished yet. Something about Margaret's calm demeanor and dignified response irritated her even more. In her experience, difficult passengers usually became angry and defensive when confronted, making it easier to justify removing them. Margaret's quiet grace somehow made Sarah feel like she was the one behaving badly, which only fueled her determination to prove she was right. "It's a big issue because safety is our #1 priority, and passengers who cannot follow basic instructions pose a risk to everyone on board," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a lecturing tone. "Perhaps next time you should consider whether you're really up for air travel, or if you might be more comfortable with other transportation options." The businessman in the seat across the aisle couldn't help but intervene. "Excuse me, but I think you're being unnecessarily harsh with this lady. She's clearly not causing any real problems." Sarah whipped around to face him, her professional smile completely gone. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but I'm trained to handle these situations and I don't need passengers telling me how to do my job. Please mind your own business." Margaret watched this exchange with growing sadness. She thought about the hundreds of training sessions she had personally overseen, where customer service and treating passengers with dignity were emphasized above all else. She remembered the company motto she had written herself: "Every passenger is a guest in our sky." A young mother with 2 small children was watching from a few rows back, her kids asking loudly why the nice lady was in trouble. Their innocent questions carried clearly through the cabin, adding to Margaret's embarrassment. She had grandchildren, the same age, and could imagine how confused they would be by this situation. Sarah noticed the children staring and decided to use the opportunity to make her point even stronger. "You see, children, this is why it's important to listen to the flight crew and follow all the safety rules. When people don't cooperate, it can cause problems for everyone else." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. She had not cried in public since her husband's funeral 5 years ago, and she wasn't going to start now. Instead, she stood up slowly and began gathering her things with as much dignity as she could manage. "I'll move to the seat you've assigned," Margaret said softly. "But I want you to know that in all my years of flying, I have never been treated with such disrespect." Sarah felt a moment of doubt when she saw the genuine hurt in Margaret's eyes, but she pushed the feeling away. Her supervisor had made it clear that being too soft with passengers was a career-limiting mistake, and she had worked too hard to get this job to let sympathy interfere with her professional duties. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. If you feel you've been treated unfairly, you can file a complaint with customer service after the flight," Sarah replied in a tone that suggested she doubted any complaint would go anywhere. As Margaret slowly made her way toward the back of the plane, she passed by dozens of passengers who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed annoyed by the disruption, and a few appeared uncomfortable with how the situation had been handled. She kept her head high, but inside she felt more disappointed than angry. Captain James Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit, having heard raised voices during his pre-flight checks. He was a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience, and he had learned to trust his instincts about when situations were being handled poorly. Something about the scene in front of him didn't feel right. "Is everything all right here?" he asked Sarah, his tone neutral but carrying the authority of his position. Sarah straightened up, glad to have the captain's attention so she could demonstrate her professionalism. "Just a minor issue with a passenger who was having difficulty. Following safety procedures, Captain. I've got it under control now." The captain looked toward the back of the plane where Margaret was settling into her new seat, then back at Sarah. His years of experience had taught him to recognize the difference between actual safety issues and power trips, and this situation was starting to look more like the latter. Captain Rodriguez walked toward the back of the plane, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. Margaret was sitting quietly in seat 32F, looking out the window with a composed expression that couldn't quite hide her distress. Something about her bearing caught his attention immediately. He had flown enough wealthy and powerful passengers over the years to recognize someone who carried themselves with natural authority, even when they were trying to remain inconspicuous. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Rodriguez. I understand there was some concern about your ability to safely stow your luggage," he said gently, crouching down beside her seat to speak at her level. Margaret turned from the window and looked at him with tired but kind eyes. "Hello, Captain. Yes, I had a brief moment of difficulty with my bag, and your flight attendant felt it was a safety issue. I've moved seats as requested." The captain noticed several things that Sarah had apparently missed. Margaret's luggage was expensive and well-made. Her clothes were elegant despite being simple, and she wore a vintage watch that he recognized as a limited edition piece given only to airline industry leaders. Most telling of all, she spoke with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Have you flown with us before?" Captain Rodriguez asked, though something about her seemed familiar. "Oh yes, quite often over the years," Margaret replied with a slight smile. "This is actually one of my favorite routes." Meanwhile, Sarah was completing her pre-flight checks with a sense of satisfaction. She had handled a difficult situation professionally and maintained order in the cabin. Her supervisor would surely notice that there had been no further disruptions and that boarding had been completed efficiently. She felt confident that she had made the right decision. The captain returned to the front of the plane, but something was nagging at him. He pulled out the passenger manifest and began scanning through the names more carefully than usual. When he reached the M's in the alphabet, his eyes stopped on one entry. Thompson, Margaret, VIP status, owner family. His heart nearly stopped. Margaret Thompson wasn't just any VIP passenger. She was the mother of Richard Thompson, the CEO and owner of Thompson Airlines. More than that, she was the co-founder of the airline itself, having started the company with her late husband over 30 years ago. She still held a position on the board of directors and was known throughout the industry as one of the most respected figures in aviation. Captain Rodriguez felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had just watched one of his flight attendants humiliate and relocate the owner's mother based on what appeared to be nothing more than a minor luggage issue. He quickly pulled Sarah aside, his expression grave. "Sarah, we need to talk privately." "Now," he said in a low, urgent tone. Sarah followed him to the galley area, puzzled by his sudden seriousness. "Is everything okay, Captain? I thought I handled that situation quite well." "Do you know who that passenger is?" Captain Rodriguez asked, holding the manifest where she could see Margaret's name. Sarah glanced at the paper, and her face went completely white as she read the entry. Her hands began to tremble slightly as the full magnitude of her mistake became clear. "Oh my God, I never checked. How was I supposed to know?" "Her name is clearly marked on the manifest with VIP status codes," the captain said, grimly. "But more importantly, you treated an elderly passenger with complete disrespect regardless of who she was. That's not who we are as an airline." Sarah felt her world crashing down around her. All her efforts to prove herself as a strict professional flight attendant had backfired spectacularly. She had not only violated the airline's customer service standards, but she had done it to the most important passenger who could possibly be on the plane. What do I do now? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You're going to march back there and apologize profusely, and then you're going to spend the rest of this flight making sure Mrs. Thompson has everything she could possibly need, Captain Rodriguez instructed. After that, you'll be writing a very detailed incident report explaining how this happened. As Sarah walked back toward Margaret's seat, her legs felt like jelly. She kept thinking about how confident and authoritative she had been just minutes earlier, and how completely wrong she had been about everything. The other passengers watched her with curiosity, sensing that something significant was happening. Margaret was still looking out the window when Sarah approached, but she turned as she sensed someone stopping beside her seat. The look in Sarah's eyes was completely different now, filled with panic and regret instead of the cold authority from before. Mrs. Thompson, Sarah began, her voice shaking. I owe you a sincere apology. I had no idea who you were, but that's no excuse for how I treated you. I was completely unprofessional and I'm deeply sorry. Margaret studied Sarah's face for a moment, seeing genuine remorse where there had been arrogance before. You know, dear, the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you treated me poorly regardless of who I was. Every passenger deserves basic respect and dignity. Sarah nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. You're absolutely right. I let my desire to follow procedures override basic human decency. I don't know how to make this right. Well, Margaret said thoughtfully, perhaps we can start with you telling me your name and a little about yourself. I find it's much easier to treat people well when you see them as individuals, rather than just problems to be managed. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to compose herself as she sat in the empty seat next to Margaret. Her hands were still trembling slightly, and she could feel the eyes of other passengers on them, waiting to see what would happen next. My name is Sarah Mitchell, she began quietly. I've been working as a flight attendant for 5 years now, and I thought I was good at my job. I graduated from college with honors, and this career meant everything to me. I guess I got so focused on following rules that I forgot why those rules exist in the first place. Margaret listened with genuine interest, her anger beginning to soften as she saw the young woman's vulnerability. Tell me about your family, Sarah. Do you have children? No, ma'am. I'm not married yet, though I hope to be someday. My parents sacrificed a lot to put me through college, and I wanted to make them proud by being the best flight attendant I could be. My supervisor has been telling us that we need to be tougher with passengers, and I thought that meant being strict about everything. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. I understand the pressure you must feel. When I started this airline with my husband 30 years ago, I made plenty of mistakes too. The difference is, I learned that being strong doesn't mean being harsh, and being professional doesn't mean being cold. Sarah looked at Margaret with new eyes, trying to imagine this gentle, elderly woman as a powerful business leader. You really started this whole airline? How did that happen? My husband, Robert, was a pilot, and I handled the business side of things. We started with just one small plane, taking people on charter flights. I did everything from booking flights, to serving coffee, to balancing the books. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, Margaret explained, her eyes lighting up with the memory. We grew slowly, one passenger at a time, and our philosophy was always simple. Treat every person who flies with us like they're a guest in our home. That's how we built loyalty and trust. People didn't just choose our airline because of our schedule or prices, they chose us because of how we made them feel. Sarah was fascinated despite her anxiety. What was it like being a woman in business back then? It must have been really difficult. It was challenging, yes. Many people didn't take me seriously at first, but I learned that earning respect has nothing to do with being intimidating or showing off your authority. It comes from competence, consistency, and treating others with dignity. The moment you start using your power to make someone else feel small, you've lost the real battle. As they talked, other passengers began to relax, sensing that the tension from earlier was dissipating. The businessman who had tried to defend Margaret earlier smiled approvingly at the conversation taking place. The young mother with children was relieved to see that the situation was being resolved peacefully. Captain Rodriguez made his usual pre-flight announcement. but he took an extra moment to emphasize the crew's commitment to passenger comfort and safety. Sarah understood that this was partly directed at her, a reminder of what her priorities should be. "Mrs. Thompson," Sarah said hesitantly, "I know I can't take back what happened earlier, but is there anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable? Can I move you back to your original seat? Or perhaps to first class?" Margaret shook her head gently. "That's kind of you to offer, dear, but I'm actually quite comfortable here. Sometimes it's good to see how the other half lives. But I would appreciate it if you could bring me some tea when you have a chance." "Of course, what kind would you prefer?" Sarah asked eagerly. "Surprise me," Margaret said with a small smile. As Sarah went to prepare the tea, she found herself thinking about everything Margaret had said. She realized that her approach to customer service had been all wrong. She had been so focused on asserting authority that she had forgotten the human element that makes air travel bearable for everyone. When she returned with a carefully prepared tray containing not just tea, but also some cookies and a small flower from the first-class service, Margaret was genuinely touched by the gesture. "This is lovely, Sarah. Thank you for taking such care with it." "Mrs. Thompson, can I ask you something?" Sarah said, settling back into the seat beside her. "What would you do if you were in my position right now? I mean, I know I'm probably going to lose my job over this, and maybe I deserve to. But if somehow I get another chance, how do I become the kind of flight attendant you would want working for your airline?" Margaret set down her tea and looked at Sarah seriously. "First, you need to understand that rules and procedures are tools to help you serve passengers better, not weapons to control them with. Second, you need to remember that every person on this plane has a story, has people who love them, and deserves to be treated with basic human kindness." "But what about passengers who really are difficult or dangerous?" Sarah asked. "Oh, those situations definitely exist, and they require firm handling. But 9 times out of 10, what looks like a difficult passenger is really just someone who's scared, confused, or having a bad day. A little patience and empathy can resolve most problems before they escalate." Margaret paused, then continued. "You know, Sarah, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who got caught up in trying to prove herself and lost sight of what really matters. The question is, what are you going to do with this lesson?" The rest of the flight passed peacefully, with Sarah checking on Margaret regularly and ensuring she had everything she needed. But more importantly, Sarah found herself paying attention to all the passengers in a completely different way. She noticed the nervous first-time flyer who needed reassurance, the businessman who was stressed about a presentation, and the elderly man who was traveling to visit his sick wife. Instead of seeing potential problems to be managed, she began to see people with individual needs and concerns. When a child spilled juice on his shirt, instead of lecturing the parents about supervision, she quietly brought cleaning supplies and helped make it right. When an anxious passenger asked for the 3rd time about turbulence instead of giving a curt response, she sat down and explained how airplanes are designed to handle rough weather safely. Margaret watched all of this with growing approval. She could see that Sarah was genuinely learning from their conversation and putting new principles into practice immediately. It reminded her of her own early days in business, when a single conversation with a mentor had completely changed her perspective on leadership. As they began their descent into Chicago, Sarah approached Margaret one final time. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to thank you for being so gracious with me today. I learned more in the past few hours than I did in years of training. But I have to ask, what's going to happen to me now? I know Captain Rodriguez is going to file a report, and I'm sure word will get back to your son." Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the city lights below. "Sarah, let me tell you something about my son, Richard. He's a good man and a fair leader, but he takes customer service very seriously. If I told him what happened, at the beginning of this flight, you would probably lose your job." Sarah's heart sank, even though she had expected as much. "However," Margaret continued, "I'm more interested in the person you became during this flight than the person you were when we started. Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes and grow." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked hopefully. "I'm saying that when Richard asks me about my flight, and he always does, I'm going to tell him that I had one of the best flight attendants I've ever encountered. Someone who went above and beyond to make sure not just me but every passenger on this plane felt cared for. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. But that's not true. I was terrible to you. It's not about how you started, dear. It's about how you finished. And more importantly, it's about what you learned. The Sarah who boarded this plane this morning and the Sarah who's about to land in Chicago are two completely different people. Growth and redemption are beautiful things. As the plane touched down and passengers began gathering their belongings, many of them approached Sarah to thank her for her exceptional service during the flight. The businessman shook her hand and said he had never experienced such attentive care from a flight crew. The young mother told her how much her children enjoyed the coloring book Sarah had found for them. Captain Rodriguez was amazed by the transformation he witnessed. He had expected to spend the flight dealing with continued tension and passenger complaints, but instead he had watched Sarah demonstrate some of the finest customer service he had seen in his career. As passengers began to disembark, Margaret stood slowly and gathered her things. Sarah immediately moved to help her, not out of obligation or fear, but out of genuine care and respect. Mrs. Thompson, it's been an honor to serve you today, and an even greater honor to learn from you. I hope someday I can be half as wise and gracious as you are. Margaret smiled warmly. You know, Sarah, I think you're well on your way already. But let me give you one piece of advice for your career. Never forget that our business is not really about moving people from one place to another. We're in the business of taking care of people during one of the most stressful parts of their journey. When you remember that, everything else falls into place. As Margaret walked off the plane, she turned back once more. Oh, and Sarah? When you make mistakes in the future, and you will because we all do, remember that how you handle those mistakes says more about your character than the mistakes themselves. Sarah watched Margaret disappear into the jet bridge, knowing that this flight had changed her life forever. She had started the day thinking she knew what it meant to be professional, but she ended it understanding what it truly meant to serve others. Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah as she was tidying up the cabin. I have to say I'm impressed by what I saw today. Whatever Mrs. Thompson said to you, it clearly made a difference. She taught me that being strong doesn't mean being harsh, and being professional doesn't mean being cold, Sarah replied, echoing Margaret's words from earlier. I think I finally understand what this job is really about. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the employee break room reading the company newsletter when she saw a familiar name in the headlines. Thompson Airlines announces new customer service excellence program. Her heart raced as she read further. The 8th article described a comprehensive training initiative designed to emphasize the human side of air travel, focusing on empathy, dignity, and genuine care for passengers. What made Sarah's hands tremble was the quote attributed to Margaret Thompson. True excellence in service comes not from following rules blindly, but from understanding that every passenger is someone's mother, father, child, or friend. When we remember this, we transform from mere service providers into guardians of the human experience. Sarah had not seen or spoken to Margaret since that transformative flight, but she had carried the lessons learned that day into every interaction with passengers. Her approach to customer service had completely changed, and the results were remarkable. Passenger compliments specifically mentioning her by name had increased dramatically, and her supervisor had noticed the positive change immediately. Just as she finished reading the article, Captain Rodriguez appeared in the break room with a serious expression on his face. Sarah's heart sank, wondering if her past mistake had finally caught up with her. Sarah, I need to see you in my office, he said formally. As they walked down the corridor, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Had someone filed a complaint? Had Margaret changed her mind about keeping their conversation confidential? She had worked so hard to rebuild her reputation over the past 3 months. Captain Rodriguez closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit down. Sarah, I've been asked to inform you that you've been selected for a special assignment. What kind of assignment? She asked nervously. Mrs. Margaret Thompson has personally requested that you be part of the team implementing the new customer service training program. Apparently, she was very impressed with your dedication to passenger care during a recent flight. Sarah felt her knees go weak. She remembered me? More than that, she specifically mentioned that she had observed you demonstrate exceptional growth and adaptation under pressure. She wants you to help train other flight attendants in what she calls authentic service excellence. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. The woman she had treated so poorly had not only forgiven her but was now advocating for her career advancement. I don't understand. What would I be doing exactly? You would be working directly with the training department to develop scenarios and role-playing exercises based on real passenger interactions. Mrs. Thompson believes that the best teachers are those who have learned from their own mistakes and can share those lessons authentically with others. That afternoon, Sarah found herself in a conference room at Thompson Airlines headquarters, face-to-face with Margaret Thompson for the first time since that memorable flight. Margaret looked exactly the same, elegant and composed, but her smile was warm and welcoming. "Hello, Sarah. I'm so glad you accepted this opportunity. Mrs. Thompson, I have to say I'm shocked that you thought of me for this position, after how I behaved that day." Margaret held up a gentle hand. "Sarah, that day you showed me something more valuable than perfect customer service from the start. You showed me the ability to learn, grow, and genuinely change your approach when you realized it wasn't working. That's exactly the kind of mindset we need in our trainers." Over the next hour, Margaret explained her vision for the new training program. It would focus on real scenarios rather than theoretical policies, emphasizing the human stories behind every passenger interaction. Sarah would help create training modules based on her own experience and transformation. "I want you to tell your story, Sarah. The whole story, including your mistakes. I believe that other flight attendants will learn more from hearing about your journey than they would from 100 policy manuals." Sarah felt both honored and terrified by the responsibility. "Are you sure you want me to talk about what happened between us? It doesn't exactly paint me in a flattering light." "That's precisely why it's so powerful," Margaret replied. "Anyone can follow a script when things are going well, but when you showed me how you could recognize your mistakes, apologize sincerely, and completely change your approach in the middle of a crisis, you demonstrated real professionalism." As their meeting concluded, Margaret stood to walk Sarah to the elevator. "You know, dear, I've been in this business for over 30 years, and I've seen thousands of employees come and go. The ones who last and thrive are not the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who learn from their mistakes and use those lessons to become better people." Sarah felt tears of gratitude forming in her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that you didn't just save my career that day. You changed my entire outlook on life. I think about our conversation every single day, and it's made me a better flight attendant. But more importantly, it's made me a better person. That's all any of us can hope for, Sarah, that we leave people a little better than we found them." 6 months later, Sarah was standing in front of a room full of new flight attendant trainees, sharing her story with honesty and vulnerability. She talked about the importance of seeing passengers as individuals, about the difference between authority and authoritarianism, and about how one conversation with a wise mentor had transformed her career. In the back of the room, Margaret Thompson sat quietly, watching with pride as Sarah inspired the next generation of flight attendants. She thought about how a single moment of grace and forgiveness had not only changed one young woman's life, but would now positively impact thousands of passengers through the ripple effects of better training. As Sarah concluded her presentation with the words, "True service excellence comes from the heart, not from the handbook," Margaret smiled, knowing that the future of customer service at Thompson Airlines was in very good hands indeed.